Many people, a number of people, wrote me about repurchases of stock, and that's the question I picked for my first one. The question this particular question comes from Ward Cookie, who lives in Belgium and who was still emailing me this morning in reference to the first quarter report. And he asks, my question concerns your repurchase of Berkshire shares. In the third quarter of last year, you spent almost $1 billion buying Berkshire B stock at an average price of $207. But then you got to a period between December 26th and April 11th when the stock languished for almost 4 months under 207, and yet you purchased what I think of as a very limited amount of stock, even as you were sitting on an enormous pile of $112 billion. My question is why you did not repurchase a lot more stock, unless, of course, there was for a time an acquisition of, say, 80 billion to 90 billion on your radar.
Yeah, the question, whether we had 100 billion or 200 billion would not make a difference, or 50 billion, would not make a difference in our approach to repurchase of shares. We repurchase shares. We used to have a policy of tying it to book value, but that really became obsolete. It did not. The real thing is to buy stock, repurchase shares only when you think you're doing it at a price where the remaining shareholders are worth more the moment after you repurchased it than they were the moment before. It's very much like if you were running a partnership and you had 3 partners in it and the business was worth $3 million, and one of the partners came and said, I'd like you to buy back my share of the partnership for $1 billion. I started out with millions, I'll stay with millions, for 1.1 million, and we'd say forget it. And if he said 1 million, we'd probably say forget it. And if he said 900,000, we'd take it, because at that point the remaining business would be worth 2 million one, and we'd have 2 owners, and our interest in value would have gone from $1 million to $1,050,000. So it's very simple arithmetic. Most companies adopt repurchase programs and they just say we're going to spend so much. That's like saying we're going to buy XYZ stock and we're going to spend so much, or we're going to buy a company and we're going to spend whatever it takes. We will buy stock when we think it is selling below a conservative estimate of its intrinsic value. Now, the intrinsic value is not a specific point. It's probably a range in my mind that might have a band maybe of 10%. Charlie would have a band in his mind, and it would probably be 10%. And ours would not be identical, but they'd be very close. And sometimes he might figure a bit higher than I do, a bit lower. But we want to be sure when we repurchase shares that those people who have not sold shares are better off than they were before we repurchased them. And it's very simple. And in the first quarter of the year, they'll find we bought something over $1 billion worth of stock. And that's nothing like my ambitions. But what that means is that we feel that we're okay buying it, but we don't salivate over buying it. We think that the shares we repurchased in the first quarter leave the shareholders better off than if we hadn't, the remaining shareholders, better off than if we hadn't bought it. But we don't think the difference is dramatic. And you could easily see periods where we would spend very substantial sums if we thought the stock was selling at, say, 25 or 30% less than it was worth, and we didn't have something else that was even better. But we have no ambition in any given quarter to spend a dime unless we think you're going to be better off for us having done so. Charlie?
Well, I predict that we'll get a little more liberal in repurchasing shares.
I was going to give you equal time, but then. Okay, John Brandt.
Hi, Warren and Charlie. Thanks for having me, as always. Every major North American railroad other than Burlington Northern has adopted at least some aspects of precision scheduled railroading, generally to good effect to their bottom line. Some believe that point-to-point scheduled service and minimal in-transit switching is good for both returns on capital and customer service. Others believe precision railroading has done little for on-time performance, and its rigidity has jeopardized the compact that railroads have had with both regulators and customers. Do you and current BNSF management believe that it's now a good idea for BNSF to adopt precision railroading playbook, or do you agree with its critics?
Yeah, precision railroading, as it's labeled, was probably invented by a fellow named Hunter Harrison. I think maybe he was at the Illinois Central Railroad at the time. There's a book that came out about Hunter, who died maybe a year ago or thereabouts, and it describes his procedure toward railroading. It's an interesting read if you're interested in railroading. And he took that to Canadian National, CN. There's 6 big railroads in North America, and he took that to CN, and he was very successful. And actually, Bill Gates is probably the largest holder of CN. So, and I think he's done very well with that stock. And then later, Canadian Pacific was the subject of activists, and when as they proceeded, they got Hunter to join them and brought in an associate, Keith Creel, and they instituted a somewhat similar program. Now the same thing has happened at CSX, and all of those companies dramatically improved their profit margins, and they had varying degrees of difficulty with customer service in the implementing of it. But I would say that we watch very carefully. The Union Pacific is doing a somewhat modified version, but we are not above copying anything that is successful, and I think that there's been a good deal that's been learned by watching these 4 railroads, and we will, if we think we can serve our customers well and get more efficient in the process, we will adopt whatever we observe. But we don't have to do it today or tomorrow, but we do have to find something that gets at least equal and hopefully better customer satisfaction, and that makes our railroad more efficient. And there's been growing evidence that from the actions of these other 4 railroads, there's been growing evidence that we can learn something from what they do. Charlie?
Well, I doubt that anybody is very interested in unprecision in railroading.
Well, Johnny, has Charlie answered your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.